So there's been some conversation over the past week surrounding the idea of video game console exclusive and exclusivity when it relates to a video game platform. And as far as I can tell, this is mostly in response to a lot of what Microsoft has been doing and their recent messaging and marketing around the whole "this is an Xbox" ad campaign that I actually discussed and broke down a little bit in a video back when that happened, probably a month or two ago. And some further decisions and statements coming out of the Microsoft and Xbox camp that seems to double down on some very strange and, in my opinion, very bad business and marketing decisions. Even though, as I said in that video, I think that the ad campaign itself is actually good because it translates the message they want to translate very well. I just happen to think that the message is bad and the business model is bad. You should choose your platform and your identity and commit to that. Don't abandon the Xbox and then just scattershot your stuff onto every single screen around the world. That's a lot less fun and exciting, and I also think it's not necessarily good for your business. However, talking about modern console exclusivity, and specifically even Xbox's current whole weird situation, is not really the focus of this video. I thought that this would be a good chance to talk broader about the idea of video game console exclusives and exclusivity as it relates to different platforms, and in a lot of ways even revisit some of the history of that. Because as somebody who's been gaming for several decades, I actually experienced a whole different era of what it meant for games to be console exclusive, in an era that I personally, as a very nostalgic guy you guys know, think was a lot better than everything that we deal with in terms of the crap of the video game industry today. Overall, just speaking high level before I go into some of the history of console exclusives, I do just want to state that my general opinion on this is that console exclusives, platform exclusives, because we can even talk about maybe PC games that can only be played on PC, they are nothing but a good thing. They've always been a good thing. I think even today, they are a good thing. And in the age of the internet and social media and YouTube and all of this stuff, there is a belief and an opinion and a conversation that goes around out there nowadays about how breaking down the barriers of exclusivity would actually be a good thing. And the more any platform can play any other platform's games is a good thing. And the more any one game can be available to multiple platforms, it benefits everybody. And while there are kernels of positive things within that, absolutely, like a good game being available to more people, yes, on the surface, that is a good thing. I think that for the health of the industry, these individual companies, the console manufacturers themselves, and for the sake of just general business competition, it is extremely important, beneficial, and healthy for the industry to rely on console exclusives for a lot of titles. Obviously, there's always going to be third-party multi-platform games, so they will continue to operate they do, and they will generate revenue the way that they do. But when it comes to Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, or even PC, having a collection of games that can only be played on that console, it is a good thing across the board. Now, this is where the fun stuff comes in, though, because I want to talk about what console exclusivity used to look like back in the day. When I say back in the day, I'm talking about the late 80s and the early 90s. Nowadays, console exclusives are pretty much relegated only to first-party games. So a Nintendo-developed or a Sony-developed IP or game, like Ratchet & Clank or a Mario or a Zelda game, those are exclusive games, the same way Halo and Gears of War traditionally have been for Microsoft and the Xbox, right? They're first-party games, so they can only be played on the console that company manufactures. And then you will also get things like a third-party exclusive, where an otherwise third-party company or developer makes a game that can only be played on your platform. Some examples of this would be Bloodborne on the PlayStation 4, or something like Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 on the Nintendo Switch. Those are great games. Bloodborne especially is amazing. And that is another way that a game can be exclusive to a console. But again, if we go back in time, we travel back to the 80s and 90s, the glory days of gaming in my opinion. We look at specifically the console war between Sega and Nintendo, when it was the Genesis versus the Super Nintendo. There was the 8-bit war, you could call it, between the NES and the Sega Master System, but that wasn't really the same thing. Sega Master System was lesser known, more underground. NES was everywhere, and it changed and revitalized the entire industry that we still play in today. But by the time the 16-bit generation started, that console war really beefed up, and it was literally people were just only playing Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis. Marketing and ad campaigns and video games being developed all were built and predicated on the idea of A system versus B system and which system does what things better. Now, at that time, what it meant for a console exclusive to exist was so different in a way that a lot of people nowadays probably don't like or don't remember fondly, but I personally do, because at that time, you would get a ton of games that were meant to release on both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. The same company would develop the same game or the same titled game, but because the systems were built differently and had different strengths in terms of graphics or sound, or how the controllers were laid out, for example, because they were extremely different at the time, you would actually get the same title on both systems, but they would look, play, feel, and sound very, very differently. The most famous example of this is the original Mortal Kombat. It's no secret to anyone that the original home port of the arcade smash hit Mortal Kombat, which defined a generation, including my life at the time, was very differently built for both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo version, in my opinion, really did have the better graphics. I think the sound was very strong on the Genesis, but it was also still good across the board. Most notably in this situation, the difference was the violence, right? So the Genesis version allowed you to put in a code, ABACAB, ABACABB, which I will never forget, it is burned into my memory. You could put in that code and that would unlock the ability to play with all of the blood on and all of the normal fatalities in the Genesis version from the arcade. The Super Nintendo version did not have that. Nintendo was still kind of fighting a battle to kind of maintain its kiddie image and family-friendly image, and they didn't want to embrace anything that was mature or gory, but they did want the huge hit that was Mortal Kombat on their console, so they got a superior-looking version of the game, but there was no blood, no fatalities, and you would see, like, sweat coming off of the characters, and all of the fatalities were just like, I'm going to punch you really hard or kick you really hard, and you're just going to fall over. There was no spines being ripped out of anyone's bodies or anything like that. And so this was an era where console exclusives, as I've said several times, they just meant something different. And there were so many examples in the 16-bit era of how games would release on both platforms, both the two competing platforms at the time. Nowadays we have three, but at the time there was really just the two. Yes, there were others floating around in the background, like my beloved Atari Jaguar, the 3DO, the TurboGrafx 16. They did exist, but really gaming was like 95% relegated to the two titans in the industry, Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. But again, Mortal Kombat being the prime example is still not the only example. One of the other great examples are all of the Disney games, like Aladdin and the Lion King, some of the Mickey games that would release. There were so many wonderful Disney properties released as video games at the time, and they would also release on the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, and there would be a battle and a debate and a war at lunchtime and on the playground at school over which versions were better, the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis versions. For me, the prime example of the Disney games is going to be Aladdin, where I'm sorry, it is an indisputable, undeniable, objective fact, the Sega Genesis version of Aladdin absolutely demolishes the Super Nintendo version. The Super Nintendo version is fine. It's even pretty darn good. But the Sega Genesis version, oh my god, that was operating at a whole nother level. The graphics, the cartoonish vibe and element, the recreation of the music, it was so fun and so beautiful. It's one of my favorite memories of all of gaming, is specifically the Sega Genesis version of Aladdin. And it's worth noting that Aladdin is an extreme example of two completely different games. They were developed so unbelievably differently, and you can tell just by looking at the footage here, that it really stuck out, and you were really committing to one or the other. Also, we have to remember, most gamers at that time were kids, and we relied on our parents to buy us our games for the most part, so whatever platform we had, Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo, it was because it's the one that our parents bought us, or that we asked them to buy us. Not many kids had both. There were some rich kids out there who had both, but most people only had one, so you also only could play the version of Aladdin or The Lion King or Mickey Mania or whatever, based on what you had. But again, you look at Aladdin here, and they are polar opposites, and this happened a lot at the time. And there are a lot of other examples I could go on about. Different versions of Batman games for both Genesis and Super Nintendo, different versions of Power Rangers games. Primal Rage is another fighting game from that era that was huge. There are so many prime examples, and this was an era. It continued a little bit past the 16-bit generation, I'll get to that in a second, but primarily at this time, this is what console exclusives look like. And in fact, it was so prevalent, and it was so important to defining the future of gaming, as well as just the generation they were in at the time, or we were in at the time, I should say, that there's even a fantastic YouTube channel called Console Wars dedicated to this exact topic, where they literally break down and compare and contrast, in a goofy, funny way, the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions of the same games, and have a pseudo battle and a debate over which version was better. It is so much fun to watch. I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't seen them already. They've been around for years. But it's just a prime example of how important that console exclusive battle was back in the day. Weirdly, going into the next generation, where you had the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation and the Saturn as the primary consoles on the market at the time, the way multi-platform games started to release was a lot more ubiquitous, or it was becoming a lot more ubiquitous. You would find games that were essentially the same on all platforms, like Rayman or the Alien trilogy for the PlayStation and the Saturn. And you would get differences based on limitations of hardware, but they would be striving to make the same game. In fact, it would be the same game. Same graphics, same engine, same concepts, same levels, and all of that stuff. But if one system had better graphics or the other one had better sound, kind of like with the 16-bit era, they would just remove or tweak those things, as opposed to develop completely different versions of the games, which is what they were doing for the most part in the 16-bit era. And so that means, for the most part, at that time, console exclusives were literally just games only releasing on those consoles, many times by first parties. Look at all of the Nintendo games on the 64, for example. You know, Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation 1, Dreams into Nights on the Sega Saturn. Those were games made by those companies just for those platforms. Well, Metal Gear Solid was made by Konami, not Sony. But that was an example of how games would release exclusively on just the one console. Yes, you'd get the Tony Hawks that would release across the board, but for the most part, that's what things looked like at that time. I would say that's how things continued for a while. And I think that maybe the last time we saw console exclusives operate similarly to the 16-bit era would be in the 7th generation because of the Nintendo Wii. The 7th generation was so insanely unique because you had two consoles that had made the jump to HD for the first time, but you also had the Nintendo Wii that was kind of holding out on standard definition gameplay and technology. Kind of continuing what the GameCube was doing, but relying on the motion controls, as we all know. And so because of that, initially, games had to be made individually for the Wii that wouldn't release on the 360 and the PS3, and vice versa. Games coming out on the PS3 and 360 would not be coming to the Wii because the power difference was so extreme and polar opposite. And again, two of them were operating in HD, and the Wii was operating in SD, in standard definition. But the Wii ended up becoming such a huge smash hit and such a hot item that eventually these companies did start developing Wii-specific versions of games that were coming to the HD consoles, the PS3 and the 360. And when that happened, we saw, just like in the 16-bit era, games that were the same or meant to be the same as the HD counterparts, but they were developed by a totally different team, and they were looking and playing extremely different. There's a few prime examples of this, but one that jumps to mind would be Star Wars The Force Unleashed. That was a huge game and a huge release at the time. It was one of those games for the 360 and PS3 that was kind of pushing those systems and really showcasing the great graphics and gameplay and everything. But the Wii, of course, was not going to be able to make a comparable game. So they did, of course, want to take advantage of the popularity of the Wii, and they did make a Star Wars Force Unleashed game for the Wii, but it looked very different. It just looked like a fancy GameCube game, and I can't speak to how much the levels and story was the same, because I didn't play the other versions. I only played the Wii version. But I do think it was designed with different levels and a different layout. And then, of course, the simple fact that the Wii featured the Wii Remote and motion controls, and Star Wars uses lightsabers, they also baked in a totally different control scheme relying on the motion controls. That was another thing that would set Wii ports apart from the other two versions on the HD consoles. Some other great examples of this happening would be the Call of Duty games. The biggest franchise in the industry, they were blowing up sales charts on the 360 and PS3, but once the Wii took off, they didn't want to leave the Wii in the dust, so eventually they remade the first Call of Duty Modern Warfare game, and they called it Modern Warfare, was it Reflex or Redux? I can't remember. I think it's Reflex. And I actually had it, and it was a totally different standard definition version of Modern Warfare, including online multiplayer, taking advantage of the Wii Remote and Nunchuck, and it was pretty successful and popular. I think that came out the same time Modern Warfare 2 did on the other consoles, but through that spawned many other ports and Wii-specific versions of Call of Duty games, including Black Ops and Modern Warfare 3. And so, whether you're looking at the 16-bit generation of console-exclusive games, or if you're looking at the Wii era of console-exclusive games, where in both of those generations, they were making games that would be the same title, by the same developer, but catered to the strengths of that console, that's an idea of what console exclusives used to look like, as far as just a business model. And it was really exciting and fun in the 16-bit generation. In the 7th generation with the Wii, there were pluses to it and things that I liked about it, but it also felt a little bit more frustrating because you had one console so stringently stuck in the past, at least in terms of power. The controls were moving forward with the Wii Remote and Nunchuck, but the power and the graphics were clearly a step behind, and so it felt different at the time, not as exciting in the 16-bit era where you get to say, the one that I have is the best one and the one that you have is the worst one. But looking at console exclusive today, it's different than ever before, right? Because the advent of the internet and gaming subscription services like Game Pass, store launchers like Steam or EA Play or whatever EA's game launcher is, I don't even know what the hell it's called. I think the Epic Store is its own game launcher, you know, and the fact that Sony and Nintendo do a good job, well, mostly Nintendo is the one still doing a good job making sure their exclusive IPs and their exclusive games carry their product and their business and their hardware sales. No one is doing it as good as Nintendo nowadays. It's crazy. PlayStation 5, I love the PlayStation 5. There are a lot of exclusive games being developed for it, but there hasn't been as many first-party games in a while. I know that's been a big complaint. I personally don't care because I got to play Silent Hill 2 Remake and, well, Astrobot's a first-party game. Silent Hill 2 Remake and Astrobot, and Ratchet & Clank was a game at one point that also came out of the PlayStation 5 that was exclusive. You know, there are plenty of those games that do certainly exist on the PlayStation 5. Xbox, it's messier. Halo Infinite's great, but we haven't had a new Gears of War in a while. They are making one, but they also purchased Bethesda and Activision, but they're releasing those games cross-platform. Starfield is yet to go cross-platform, but I think that we all believe it eventually will. And by the time The Elder Scrolls 6 comes out, I think they'll probably make that cross-platform too. And so, exclusivity definitely has a different meaning nowadays. And it doesn't operate the way it did back in the day where if they were going to make The Elder Scrolls 6 and release it on all 3 platforms, or 4 including PC, you wouldn't get a unique version of that game on all the platforms. It's going to be identical, you know, to the best it can be based on the power and abilities of that console. It's not the same as what it used to be. And at the end of the day, it's still fine. I mean, exclusives are great today. Again, Nintendo is killing it. But it's really fun to kind of look back and think about how exclusives used to exist in the olden days, in the 80s and 90s, and how different it was, and how different that console race was, too. It was very different, the 16-bit console war. So much more fun and so much more pure-hearted compared to what it is today. And all the mess and noise of the internet and social media and smartphones and stuff that infects the way we like and talk about our favorite consoles. I mean, I referenced this in my recent video about the 6th generation of gaming. So I thought that this would be a fun kind of stroll through some gaming history and an interesting topic to talk about for you guys, especially if maybe you weren't even around gaming at the time. Either you weren't gaming or maybe you just weren't born yet. That's what it used to look like. So hopefully you found this kind of interesting and fun and sort of educational. I enjoyed talking about it because the 16-bit generation is my favorite generation of all time. So this was a lot of fun. Thanks for watching, guys, and that's about it.